If you need further evidence that the people who claim to promote, advocate for, and protect open source couldn't give more than a tiny little fart about open source or openness in general, look no further than the Open Source Initiative's latest actions, the Open Source Artificial Intelligence Definition. They've got a draft of it going right now, and they're about to ratify this thing, and it is hilariously not open. Literally, the core of the open source AI definition is that the data used in an open source AI can be as closed as you want it to be. It's literally not a joke. A little bit of a background here. The Open Source Initiative has been around for many years. The core of their foundation is that they are the maintainers of the open source definition. And the open source definition was created many moons ago by a guy named Bruce Perens. And the idea of it was very, very simple. Create a handful of rules governing what institutes open source. Pretty straightforward, right? Like source code has to be available. You need to be able to distribute the source code. And there can be a lot of different variations therein, but if you adhere to these simple rules, then the Open Source Initiative and other organizations would consider your license or your project to be open source. Very straightforward. Now, we could argue about whether or not this is actually necessary or needed, but it exists, it is referenced, and it is in many ways actually fairly important to the broader open source world. So the Open Source Initiative has come along, I suppose, in an effort to remain relevant in these AI-fueled days, and they have created the Open Source AI definition, which tries to do the same thing, to declare what rules does a license or a software project need to adhere to in order to be declared open source artificial intelligence. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, they've got a draft here. It's just about to be ratified, and I want to read a really key bit of it here to you, because this key bit is absolutely not just a deal breaker, but it opens your eyes as to what the actual motivation of the creation of this document is. And this is the very, very first real rule that's laid out. Okay, the preferred form of making modifications for a machine learning open source AI must include, okay, here we go. This is the key. Buckle up. Data information, sufficiently detailed information about the data used to train the system, because AI systems, they have to be trained by just mountains of data. The data in an AI system is essentially the source code in a lot of ways, right? So about the data used to train the system so that a skilled person can recreate a substantially equivalent system using the same or similar data. Okay, now a lot of you are going, what the heck did I just read here? What this is saying is this, and this has been talked about at great length within the open source initiative and related communities. What this means is that if you want to have a system, an open source AI system that gets the stamp of approval of the Open Source Initiative that says this is open source artificial intelligence, you do not have to release any of the data used to train your large language model AI system. None at all. It can remain 100% closed, private, and secret. All you have to do is describe it, right? So for example, you simply say, the data I have consists of a bunch of tweets and blog posts and some data over here and some financial data on the back end and this other data we have over here that you can't look at, and that's the data that's modeled after. Because as long as you describe what it is, and any person, a skilled person, can recreate a substantially equivalent system using the same or similar data, that means even if they don't have access to the data, well, then your project or your license will still be considered open source AI, because if someone did have access to your data, then they could recreate the system. Do you see what they're doing here? It doesn't have to be open to be open. That's what the open source initiative is saying here. It's not just kind of halfway open. It can be 100% closed. This is literally a real thing that's happening here. They can literally create an open source, quote unquote, AI system where maybe some of the source code is released publicly, right? So the source code of the system, but none of the data, and you just simply describe what the data is. That is the most insane thing I possibly have ever heard. Just to put this in context, that would be like saying, I wrote a video game in C, right? Or C++ or whatever. And it's open source. It's an open source video game. I'm not going to give you the source code, but I'm going to tell you what it looks like. It's got a lot of functions, and it's got some headers in it, and I can put comments all over the place. If I describe it to you such that you could then, if you did have the source code, compile it, then it's open source. Even if you don't actually have the source code to compile it. Do you see the problem here? So this has been brought up by a ton of people. I'm not the first person to point out that this is absolutely asinine, right? However, the open source initiative leadership has been pushing this hard. Stefano Maffuli, the current president of the open source initiative, has been doing the rounds, making speeches about how it's amazing, it's awesome. The open source initiative has been taking to social media, talking about how this person or that person has signed off on it and it's ready to go 100% with no changes. We're ready to rock and roll. And they're pushing it. They're pushing it hard. Now, there's a lot of blowback within the open source initiative community, right? Among people who regularly contribute and volunteer to the open source initiative. I'm going to read a little bit to this to you now, because this is on the opensource.org, the Open Source Initiative's forum site, where they are encouraging people to provide feedback on this particular new open source AI definition. They're not listening to feedback about this part of it so far, but they're encouraging people to give it. This is from a person named Julia. Hi, everyone. After lengthy discussions, we have serious concerns about the feasibility of the draft in its current form based on our experiences as open source practitioners, machine learning researchers, and recovering compliance people. I like the idea of recovering compliance people. That just makes me laugh a little bit. We outlined them below and hope to provide a cohesive place to discuss them here in this post. The concerns are not linearly separable, which is why we elected to put them in one single post as opposed to break them up. But the overarching concerns, and the big one that everyone's pointing out, is the need for data. And I'm going to read a little bit to you here because Julia did a great job of summarizing some of this. First and most importantly, for an open source AI definition to achieve its goals of modifiability, an AI system must include the data used to train the system. We are aware of the challenges that this poses for the definition, but the very model openness framework that the current definition references states that full transparency and reproducibility requires the release of all datasets used to train, validate, test, and benchmark. For AI systems, data is the equivalent of source code, and we explicitly require that source code must be obtainable for software to qualify as open source. The current definition marks these as, quote, optional. Where the inclusion of datasets poses a privacy or legal risk, we suggest the use of equivalent synthetic data to meet this requirement, where the synthetic data achieves comparable results when training the model. There clearly are concerns here, right? Companies do not want to release their data. They spent a lot of money pulling together this massive amount of data and licensing this data in order to train their large language models. OpenAI, Facebook, Microsoft, and so many others, they don't want to release all of their data and all of their source code just to be considered open source, right? They want to have that open source buzzword on it, but that's their bread and butter, is all that data, so they don't want to release it. But the fact still stands. If you don't have that data, you don't have the same model. You don't have the same source code. You cannot achieve the same reproducible results, which calls into question, who is funding this? I mean, it's a fair question to ask, is who exactly is funding the development of the open source artificial intelligence definition, right? Who is doing it? Well, let's look at it. This is the Open Source Initiative's public-facing corporate sponsors page. Let's scroll down. Oh, number one, Google, who has deeply closed source AI dataset models, and a very good reason, business-wise, to keep that closed. They have monetary incentive here, right? Let's keep scrolling down. Amazon also has an artificial intelligence business going on. Scrolling down a little bit. Oh, GitHub. GitHub is all about AI using closed proprietary data sets. Now, some of the data sets for GitHub are open, but huge amounts of it are closed because, lest we forget, GitHub's AI system, their Copilot, whatnot, is actually trained on closed source code in private paid premium GitHub repositories. So if companies use GitHub repositories to host their commercial software products, GitHub is actually training their AI on that closed source code. So they can't distribute it. They kind of are already, so they're kind of already in a little bit of trouble, but they certainly can't just publish it all for the world to see without any modifications. That's definitely going to get them sued every which way from side. Meta's on here again. Huge mountains of data that they don't want to give away, right? But they also want everyone to look at their artificial intelligence systems, and they want to be able to call them open source. Red Hat is repositioning their entire business around artificial intelligence. Look at the previous Red Hat Summit earlier this year. The entire Red Hat Summit, with the exceptions of a few minor little tiny mentions of Linux, was about artificial intelligence. And as soon as and artificial intelligence being open source, right? That was everything. They want to see the ability to declare artificial intelligence as open source while still working with Google, Amazon, GitHub, Meta, keep scrolling down, Microsoft, and more. So they need an open source AI definition that allows them to work with companies that have closed source data sets. It's absolutely critical to the Red Hat and IBM business. We're just talking money here. So these are the people that are paying the Open Source Initiative to create an open source AI definition. And that open source AI definition clearly, very distinctly, caters to having closed source, secret, proprietary data sets, training models, and the works. Interesting. I think so. Now let's think about this from a little bit of a higher perspective about the Open Source Initiative. Because the Open Source Initiative is not the organization that it initially was. In fact, as of now, the two founders of the Open Source Initiative, Bruce Perens and Eric Raymond, have been banned from the Open Source Initiative. In 2005, the Open Source Initiative rejected a membership application from Bruce Perens. That's right. I'm going to repeat that. The guy who founded the Open Source Initiative and wrote this document, the open source definition, the original one, that guy applied to be a member, not on the board, not to run the thing, just an average run-of-the-mill voting member of the Open Source Initiative Foundation. He was rejected. They said, no, you can't come in here. Holy moly. In March of 2020, Eric Raymond, who also helped co-found the Open Source Initiative, was completely banned. Now, not just that he can't be a member, but he was banned from even their public mailing lists. He's not even allowed to talk to Open Source Initiative people. That is how much the Open Source Initiative current leadership fears the people who founded the Open Source Initiative. Red flags and red alarms going off everywhere. I mean, it's basically an air raid of something fishy is afoot. I want to also call your attention to this. And this is a weird story, but this is a side note to what's happening with the Open Source Initiative. The Open Source Initiative has stated that they are the holders, the maintainers of the open source definition. And they repeatedly talk about the history of open source. This makes sense, right? They're the Open Source Initiative. They talk about the history of open source. Well, what's really fascinating is the story that they push is actually false. They push a story, a very strange story, that the phrase open source was created in 1998 by a person named Christine Peterson. The problem with that story is that it is easy to verify, super easy, dog easy to verify that it is completely false, just by simply trudging back through press releases. I mean, heck, 2 years earlier, Caldera was using the phrase open source when they were releasing an open source version of their version of DOS. I don't know if many people remember that, but it did happen prior to that. And years prior to that, you have journalists and government agencies talking about open source. What's really fascinating to me about this is that even though the Open Source Initiative is very, very, very aware that they've been pushing a completely made up false history of even the phrase open source, no matter how many times it gets brought to their attention, they continue to repeat the lie. Why? How truly bizarre. What on earth could they possibly get by changing the history of the usage of a phrase that's been in common usage since the 1980s? I honestly couldn't tell you. I've documented it. If you go to Lunduke.com, you can find that amongst a series of other fantastic history articles. That one is entitled, "Who Really Coined the Term Open Source? The Story You've Heard is Wrong." But it's worth taking a look at that because there seems to be a strange, if not pattern, but a picture forming. The Open Source Initiative deliberately lies about the history of what open source is and even the usages of the word. Why? I don't know. The Open Source Initiative takes all of their funding from predominantly closed source software companies and then turns around and creates what is essentially a closed source open source AI definition. What in the heck is going on? And they won't even let the founders of the Open Source Initiative back into the organization. What on earth is going on over there? Now, you could say, Lunduke. The Open Source Initiative is pointless. The Open Source Initiative is irrelevant nowadays. And part of me wants to agree with that. In fact, that is a point I've made repeatedly. However, it is not entirely true. The reality is that these organizations, like the Open Source Initiative, like the Linux Foundation and others, are funded by the companies who want to influence the industry. What happens is these organizations get funded by, let's say Amazon and Microsoft and Meta and GitHub and Intel and Cisco and all the other ones. And a bunch of money pours in. And they create definitions, they create licenses, they push particular visions, and they push those narratives forward upon the open source industry. And the open source industry reacts. Now, when you say the open source industry, you're really talking about these same companies plus a few others. They have a tremendous amount of influence. So if you are, let's say, Meta, right? The people behind Facebook, and you are Google, and you are Microsoft, and you want to influence the open source world to be more closed. Well, you can create a multi-pronged approach. You invest into the Open Source Initiative and encourage them to create new definitions of what open source is that include closed source secret stuff, right? You then invest into the Linux Foundation, and you do the exact same thing. You invest into the W3C and you do the exact same thing. And that is exactly what's happening here. The Open Source Initiative pushing an open source AI definition with closed data. The W3C pushing closed source extensions as part of the World Wide Web standard. You have the Linux Foundation being super Linux Foundation-y. This is a common problem, and could be a lot of reasons for it. I suspect that many people listening to me talk about this are going to have different views about what the core of the problem is. But the first thing we need to do is recognize that there's something funky going on. There's something fishy in the air, and we need to be clear about it. Now, by me coming out and saying this, by me making a big deal about it, will the open source initiative modify the open source definition to be less closed and be more open? One can hope. I would like to see that. I have my doubts, but we'll find out. Weirder things have happened lately. I want to say before we head off into the sunset, thank you once again to all of the subscribers of the Lunduke Journal. You really do make all of this possible. Lunduke.com and lunduke.locals.com. The people who subscribe there keep the lights on and allow me to do this work, because there's literally no other tech news outlet that's in existence right now that refuses to take money from big tech. It's just me, baby. So get out there, subscribe, get a free subscription, get a paid subscription, whatever. Spread the word about the Lunduke Journal and help keep things going, and help me keep some feet pressed to the fire here, because it's desperately, desperately needed. But thank you to everyone who helps make that possible. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.